It's Saturday the 9th of July, and today I thought I would give you a guided tour around my bonsai benches. So I'm just starting at the entrance to my home, and just in the porch I've got a couple of display shelves which I bought from Amazon. Now, I've never been entirely sure whether this is a Norwegian maple or a sycamore, but it's a 2-year-old seedling which I've grown from seeds which fell from my neighbour's tree. Just above it here on the shelf I've got a pyracantha which I bought from the local garden centre, and that's in a lovely little Shohin pot from Tom Butterworth, who is a favourite potter of mine. I just love the aesthetics of his pots. Here's the other shelf, and this is a deshojo Japanese maple that I bought from Morrison's supermarket. Just on the way we've got a couple of Japanese maples which are garden trees, and we've got a Jordan here, and this lovely tree is a firecracker. Just hiding underneath that is a blackthorn which I bought in a pot with about 6 trees from the local garden centre, and I separated them out. I put a bit of wire on this one to give it a bit of shape. So here we are on our approach to the garden proper. Just on the side here we've got a mortar board which I bought from a local builder's merchant, which I have used for mixing soil and just generally keeping all the crap together when I'm repotting trees. So here we are in the garden. Now, when I initially moved in here about 6 years ago, the hard landscaping had been done, so there was a lovely patio, there was a retaining wall, but the upper garden was just a lawn, just a flat lawn, and in the top area where the tea house is now, there was bark chippings, and the previous occupants had had a trampoline up there for the children. And about 3 years ago we added the koi pond. Boxed in the area up there with a bamboo fence, and the tea house, a B&Q corner arbour with a couple of enhancements just to give it a Japanesey feel. The Japanese Norrøn curtain was inspired by Morten Albeck's garden. So just by the door here we've got a Podocarpus Buddhist pine bonsai. Now, if I'm honest, it's probably been sat here and a little bit neglected this season, but I've had the tree probably about 3 years, and initially the trunk had a very straight style to it, so with a little bit of wire I pulled that down and gave it a more shapely look. I just recently trimmed this branch here. There was a long bit of growth coming out, and I think just the shape of it is a little bit better having lost that. Just next to it here I've got an Anna Irene Japanese maple which came from the local garden centre. There were actually 2 plants in the pot, so I separated those out and I've put it into some bonsai mix in a pond basket to help develop the roots. And just behind that there's an olive tree which again came from the local garden centre. I just applied a little bit of wire to try and add some shape, and I'm just really leaving that to develop. Up here I've got another display shelf. Again, it came from Amazon, cost about £30. I've got a couple of smaller trees on the shelves here. So there's a Japanese holly, which has never really amounted to much, and was just a cheap acquisition from a garden centre. I saw it looking a bit sad and neglected and felt sorry for it. Just underneath it here we've got another Norwegian maple sycamore, which was a seedling from my neighbour's tree about 2-3 years ago, and I've just placed it into this nice pot which I got from eBay. And every so often I defoliate this and I get a second flush of much smaller leaves. So at the start of the season there's always a couple of huge hand size leaves on there. With a bit of wire I've given a nice bit of shape to the trunk there, and I'm just really waiting for that to develop. The pot is actually full of Irish moss, so I need to get rid of that. I'm not going to worry too much about it at the moment, but I think when I come to repot it and repot several of my other trees next year, I just need to make sure I get rid of all of this. And just next to it here I've got a lovely little Japanese white pine that I bought from Lee Hadfield from the Hadori Bonsai Sales group on Facebook. Now, I bought this tree having just been to the Doncaster Shohin and Mame show locally, and I saw lots of little white pines that had sort of nice shape to them and felt I needed to acquire something similar myself. So I had a look on Facebook and I saw this tree. Just up above we have, this is an azalea, which was, it was separated out from a couple of plants which I bought from the local garden centre. There were several plants in the pot, so I just split them out and put it into this pot. And it has a lovely sort of purple flower in May, June time. Immediately next to that is a Cotoneaster cutting, which is about 2 years old. So it was just literally a branch that I cut off from another plant, planted that into some soil. It rooted fairly quickly and has subsequently been sort of shaped by wire and just occasionally trimmed. I put it into this little pot which I got in a group of pots from Amazon. Unfortunately, you'll see a lot of my smaller pots appear to have been blown off or knocked off the benches, and I've had to do some kintsugi repair on there, which is a Japanese style repair where you use a sort of gold lacquer when gluing the pots back together. On the little table here I've got my huge crabapple tree which I bought from Heron's Bonsai Nursery when we visited in September of last year. I had an opportunity to meet with Peter Chan, who was thoroughly charming, and bought this tree as a souvenir of the visit. It was in a plastic pot at the time, so I made a visit to Greenwood Bonsai and acquired this pot for the tree. Just next to that I've got an oak tree which I grew from an acorn, and it's perhaps 2 years old now. It was fairly straight as far as the trunk is concerned, so I added this sort of extreme corkscrew twist to it and then placed it into this lovely Tom Butterworth pot. And to me, because it has a sort of literati look to it, it almost looks like a palm tree on a desert island. So I'm interested to see how that develops. Just behind that is my dwarf azalea, which I bought from a garden centre just north of York. And I believe it was propagated and grown by Way of Life Bonsai. It's never been a particularly vigorous or healthy looking tree, and I was concerned when I had it last year that it was in fact dead, although in May of this year it did flower. and it looks a little bit dry at the moment. It looks like it's struggling again, so I've just moved it from where it was in the porch at the front of the house just into the shade in the back garden, just to see if that helps it recover. Now it's currently in this lovely duck egg blue Walsall ceramics pot, which I think complements the lovely pink flowers very nicely. On the other side here I've got a Fuji cherry tree. Again, this was in the porch. It's looking a little bit dry, so I've moved it into the shade in the back garden. It has, for me, a really nice sort of literati style. When I bought it, there was another branch coming out here, but it immediately sort of lent itself to a sort of windswept literati look. And at the beginning of this year I planted it into this lovely studded round pot, which I think complements it very nicely. The tree itself has something of a claw root here, but I think the fact that it's in a rounded pot means that I can get away with that. I think it balances it quite nicely. Just behind that we have a couple of Chinese elm trees. The first of these, this one looks quite healthy and has always done very well. It's been very, very vigorous. Again, this one has often been in the porch at the front of the house. And it was in fact a £10 tree which I bought from Asda, the supermarket. What appealed to me about this was, although many of those sort of cheap mass-produced trees have very sort of stick-like trunks, this one has got a little bit of taper to it and immediately appealed to me. The one behind it I got from the local garden centre. It has a very twisty trunk, and I loved the pot that it was in. In the corner here underneath my cherry garden tree I have a Chinese juniper which I bought from Elmbrook Bonsai. Now it is a tall tree, and looking at it I felt that there were potentially two trees in there, so I'm attempting to air layer the top part, which I think will make a nice tree on its own, and we've got a separate little tree underneath. So I'm just really waiting for the roots to develop there before I can separate them. Over here we've got a couple more garden trees. We've got a Acer palmatum atropurpurea. Over here there's a magnolia, and just hiding behind that there's a hawthorn tree, which, as you can see, I bought from the local garden centre at a really good price. So I applied a bit of wire to that just to give a bit of shape to the trunk, and every so often just trim the extended growth just to try and encourage ramification. On the side here we've got some more garden trees. Acer palmatum atropurpurea again. Here's a beech tree I've had for a number of years, just trying to develop the branching on it. The area on the trunk down here, it looked like the branches were all on one particular side, so it looked like there was some empty space here. So what I'm trying to do at the moment is to thread graft another branch onto the trunk just there. So behind it there is a donor tree. I've drilled a hole through the tree here, and the branch is growing through the hole, and I'm just holding that in position, and the aim is that that branch will thicken up, the cambium will meet up, and then at some point I will be able to separate the branch at that point. Now I'm not sure it will ever be a particularly elegant or great tree, and I might be wasting my time, but it's an experiment, so just see how that works out. Just behind it we've got a cherry tree. Now, if I'm right, this tree I think grew from a seed which I found in the front garden, and I dug it out, stuck it in a pot, and just frequently just trim it. It's one of those trees where if you defoliate it, you get a second flush of leaves which are much smaller and much more in proportion. Just in front of here we've got a tray of various cuttings and seedlings, some of which are doing okay, some of which are struggling a bit. So we've got some cuttings from the Chinese junipers that I've got, and just really letting those root. And they seem to root quite readily, but I just need to give them a little bit more time to develop more roots. Down here we've got a viburnum, which I bought from RHS Hollow Car, and it's really an experiment to see whether it's any good as a bonsai plant. You can see that it gets quite large leaves, so it's a case of seeing whether I can reduce those and develop a sort of sensible branching structure on there. Behind that is a hamamelis. Now, when I bought this plant, it had quite long branches, so my partner was horrified when I brought it home and reduced that by at least 50%. And now it's just a case of letting that develop. Again, it develops quite large leaves, so it might be a struggle to turn that into a sensible bonsai. Just next to that is an Acer palmatum bloodgood, which I bought from a garden centre, and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with that yet. I think I'd intentionally intended to plant it as a garden tree in the top part of the garden. And just in the corner there is a Chinomales Chinese quince, which again I bought from the garden centre for probably about £8. And I'm just going to let it thicken up a bit before I sort of cut it back, and then see whether I can find a nice suitable bonsai pot for it. On the table here I've got a number of trees, starting with this one here. This was a very recent acquisition from a local garden centre which we'd never visited previously, but which appeared to have a lovely collection of potentially suitable trees. There were actually some enormous thorn redwoods for a very reasonable price, that had enormous thick trunks, perhaps 6 inches wide, but were about 3 foot high. And although it's the sort of tree that would probably appeal to a lot of people, it didn't suit my particular bonsai aesthetic. But I did see this Batila white chocolate, so Arctic birch. I thought it had some potential, so I removed some branches, made a chunk drop up here, and we'll just leave that to recover now until next year. Again, it was another tree that was perhaps 5 foot high, and I brought it home and immediately reduced it down to about 1.5 foot, to the horror of my other half. Just next to that we've got another hawthorn tree, which I bought from a garden centre for £2.99, and it's currently sitting in a Tom Butterworth pot. And you can probably see from the trunk, it had some wire applied to it to give it a bit of shape, and you can see where the wire was biting in, where I didn't remove it quite soon enough. Now, I'm hoping that over time this will develop a bit of character. The other branches up above, they've got nice twists and bends where I applied the wire. The only problem is that perhaps it's a bit of a thin trunk, and again it might be a tree that benefits from being planted in the ground, or is grown as a literati with branches growing downwards. In front of that is another Cotoneaster cutting really, which I grew and which is probably about 2 years old. Just applied a little bit of wire to that to give it a bit of shape, and put it into this lovely pot which I got from Elmbrook Bonsai for I think £10. Just here I've got another Fuji cherry tree which I'm growing in a pond basket, and initially there were additional branches coming out of here and I've cut it back quite severely. I also air layered several branches off the top here, which you'll see shortly. There were 3 branches coming out which I turned into a triple trunk tree, which is now growing happily. Now I'm hoping to get a lovely little pot to put this into, and I'm very much someone who appreciates the smaller Mame and Shohin trees as opposed to the larger trees. I think this will develop nicely. Just here I've got a lovely Nick Payne Springwood ceramics pot, which I had a Japanese Chinese quince growing in. Unfortunately, it struggled this year, and so I had to get rid of that tree. But a lovely pot which I can use. This is a Liquidambar which I bought from RHS Harlow Car Garden on my last visit, and they develop a lovely sort of orangey red coloured leaf in autumn. This was another tree that was perhaps 3 foot, 4 foot high, and I've reduced down, and just really now trying to encourage it to put out some new shoots and branches and see how that develops. Just next to that here I've got a Paul's Scarlet Hawthorn tree which I bought from an online bonsai nursery, britishbonsai.co.uk. Now for my money it has a tall twisty trunk, but perhaps it's a bit too exaggerated, so I think somebody's gone a bit crazy with the wire, and it doesn't look like any kind of natural tree. So I looked at the top of the tree here and thought that makes a nice tree in itself, and so I decided to try air layering that. Not been massively successful so far. I think one of the problems I have is that often the moss that I've applied is very, very damp, and what I get is a lot of callousing, but not much root. I've seen others who perhaps have been a bit more successful. The moss has been a bit drier, so I've tried sealing that a bit better. I've cut away at the callus, applied some rooting hormone, and hopefully that will root and make for 2 separate trees. But the Paul's Scarlet Hawthorn, it's a lovely, lovely tree with a lovely flower on it. And just behind that is a Japanese white pine on black pine rootstock, which I bought from the guys at All Things Bonsai, which is probably my favourite nursery, and it's certainly one that's very close to where I live. It's just on junction 31 on the M1. It's just a little way south of where Meadow Hall is, and I went to the nursery looking to acquire a Japanese white pine, and I had in mind probably something which was a lot taller than this, but less refined looking. And I saw this tree, and as I said, because I have a love for the smaller trees, I just fell in love with this and had to buy it. Now this season it has put out a lot of new needles, and I think perhaps it's been overwatered, and so those needles are a little bit on the longer side. So I'll see how I get on with that going forward. I think for me, one of the reasons I wanted to acquire another Japanese white pine is that they're still something of an alien species to me. I'm far more familiar with working on deciduous trees, and so this is as much an experiment and a learning experience as anything else. This is something of a Heinz 54 varieties Japanese maple, which again I bought from Adam and Jude at All Things Bonsai for a very nice price. It's a tree that in very early spring each year goes absolutely crazy with growth, and it's been cut back quite severely to try and manage that growth. And again, it's putting out some long shoots which I need to trim back. But if you'd seen this tree in March time, March, April, it's just a massive growth everywhere. It's a very, very vigorous tree. Here we are by the pond, and we've got a couple of garden trees. This is a Siryu Japanese maple. Just next to that is a beech tree, which I acquired when I was looking for something to thread graft. The tree which I've shown you previously. Just next to that is a Cotoneaster, which I've had. It's probably one of the earliest bonsai trees I developed myself from garden centre material. Now, this season I cut off quite a large branch which was growing from here. Just really to try and reshape the tree and try and make it a little bit more interesting. This here is one of my favourite personal trees that I've developed from scratch, and it's a grove of butterfly Japanese maples, and these were 6 3-pound trees which I bought from a local supermarket. Initially they were grown in a 40cm plastic pot which I bought from Amazon, and last year I bought a 40cm ceramic pot from the guys at All Things Bonsai, and so the trees have been growing in there since. The next tree here is a Benny Maker Japanese maple which I bought this year, and I just planted that into a Paul Rogers ceramic pot which I had, and just really letting that develop. It's a tree that's very much like the deshojo in that it has a very bright red spring colour. Just to the side of that is another cherry tree. And again, it's a tree that if I defoliate it, it gets a second crop of leaves which are much, much smaller. This tree here is just a garnet Japanese maple garden tree, and underneath that is another one of the azalea plants which I took from the pot which had I think 4 plants in it, and it's just planted in a lovely pale blue pot which I bought from Heron's Bonsai on our visit there last year. Just in front here, we've got another one of the blackthorn trees, which I bought from a local garden centre, and there were about 6 of them in the pot for about £12. So I separated them all out. We applied some wire to give a bit of shape and interest, and just let it develop. Just behind that is one of my taller trees, and it's a European larch which I bought from Banksia Bonsai in Wisbech. Now when I bought it, larch trees weren't something which I particularly considered, but I found it to be a lovely tree to work on. Larch is a very sort of vigorous growing tree. It's quite forgiving, and it has a very predictable growth habit, which makes it easy and a real pleasure to work on. It's also one of those trees which it has interest through all the seasons, really. This tree here was one of my very early bonsai attempts. I think it's a thuja, but I'm not 100% certain. And I've called it Wavy Davy because it always puts me in mind of those inflatable wavy men that you see outside car showrooms. Now, I've not really done very much with it in the last 2 or 3 years, to be honest, and just left it to its own devices. This is a Katsura Japanese maple garden tree, and just underneath it we have an attempt at a grove style of Japanese maples. Now this was inspired by a fantastic video done by Bjorn Bjorholm on the Bonsai U channel, where he takes a number of seedlings and shows you how to develop that into a clump style. Now unfortunately this was actually growing in a pond basket until this year, and I moved it into this shallow plastic pot, and it has struggled a bit this year, and it looks like a number of the trees have died off, so the future's pretty bleak for this. Perhaps I may be able to find another couple of trees that I can attach and try and get the trunks to fuse together, but we'll really just have to see. So at the moment it's sat in a more shaded spot, just seeing whether this recovers, but I think it's not looking good. So we come now to my bonsai benches proper, and as you can see, the benches themselves are constructed from dense concrete blocks, which were about £2.50 each from a local builder's merchant, with deck boards on top, and just underneath there are a couple of batons securing the 2 deck boards together. Now conveniently the bench comes to just about the same height as the retaining wall behind it, but what I've been able to do, because of the retaining wall, I put another level of bench immediately behind, and the idea there is that the pots are lifted up off the stone. The stone's less forgiving with changes of temperature, so it gets a lot colder or a lot hotter than the wood surface itself. So the temperature tends to be more constant. Now this tree has got a sad history. It was initially bought from a garden centre in the Lake District, perhaps about 3-4 years ago, and the tree when I bought it was in a small cream coloured rectangular pot, and the shape of the plant, it was sort of goblet shaped, so it had a main trunk, and then it had about 5 or 6 branches all emerging from the same point, which were obviously going to create a problem with inverse taper. So I took the radical decision to remove all but one of the uprights, and then left it to grow in a pond basket for 2 years, I think, to the point where it was beginning to look credible, and that's the point at which we decided to build the Japanese tea house. Now unfortunately the tree was hidden or secured away under a bench whilst we were doing the construction, but unfortunately a big plank of wood got knocked over and just took the top of the tree off. So 2 years of development for nothing, and it was a proper primal scream moment. And what I was left with effectively then was a nice trunk and 2 branches that were growing out horizontally, and the 2 branches were at 90 degrees to each other, and it was just horrific. So I cut back the tree in the hope that it would put out some new growth. Unfortunately it didn't, so I was left with a trunk and 2 branches growing out at awkward angles. So what I decided to do is ground layer the tree. So actually in this pot here, the majority of what was the initial tree is actually buried sideways, and so now I'm effectively trying to regrow that from scratch. So this tree's potentially got quite a journey still ahead of it. Now this is one of my favourite trees, and it's a deshojo Japanese maple which I bought from Corinne Tomlinson at Greenwood Bonsai. I went down and visited, had a look around the benches and saw these, and saw this particular one, and it really appealed to my sense of the love for smaller trees. It's got a very twisty, almost corkscrew trunk, which does present difficulties because all of the growth is effectively pointing inwards, so it takes a little bit of management and just selective pruning. And I've moved it, I think it was initially in this pot, and I just moved it into a slightly bigger pot. When I first bought it, I think it was just beginning to lose its spring colour, so it's taken on the sort of muddy green colour, and it was, I presume, planted in pure akadama, and for perhaps the first month it did very well, but as the weather got warmer, particularly because it was a smaller pot, I found that it dried out very, very quickly. And I watered it one morning before work, came home in the evening, and the whole thing had just dried out and all of the leaves had shriveled, and I was really quite upset. So what I did was I immediately moved it into the shade, defoliated it, stood it in a drip tray so it had lots of moisture around it, and eventually it did recover. But the lesson learnt there was that unless you can water very, very regularly, I'm certainly not a fan of planting trees in pure akadama. So the mix it's in now has got some organic component in it and is a lot more forgiving, so I don't have to worry about watering sort of 2-3 times a day when the weather's really warm. And you can see the tree's quite happy. Next to that, here we've got another one of the sycamore Norwegian maple seedlings, which actually came from that tree up there, which every couple of years drops hundreds of seeds into the garden. And what's interesting is that the other seedling that I've got from the same batch is green, and this one is red. Just behind that is another one of my very earliest bonsai, and it's a Cotoneaster with a variegated leaf. Now, any plant that has variegated leaf is going to be a more slow grower because it doesn't have the green chlorophyll in the leaves to photosynthesize, and that has proven to be the case here. It's been quite a slow grower. It was initially in a larger rectangular pot, and when I moved and repotted this deshojo, I put this tree into the pot that it was initially in. I don't know that it will ever be a stunner of a tree, but as an early effort, I guess I have a bit of affection towards it. Now, just behind the deshojo here on the bench, I have a Katsura Japanese maple, which I acquired from B&Q DIY store for about £8, and I acquired that about 3 years ago, and it was sat in a pond basket for probably 2 of those years, just thickening up. And initially it looked a bit awkward. There was a thick branch to one side and a thick trunk, and by slowly sort of trimming back and managing the growth, trimming back the stronger areas that I wanted to thin out and letting the rest of the tree extend, it's taken on a very pleasant form. And so this spring I planted it into this ceramic pot, and I'm really quite pleased with how it's developed. So it has a nice shape, and you can see it's got really nice nabari developing.